is an extension of my personal campaign to educate myself and others politically and internationally at a time of America very clearly manifesting its fascist elements and various colonial conflicts occurring from Gaza to Ukraine, and both ethnic tensions caused by British colonial rule in South Sudan and a split from colonial rule in 1956, and ethnic tensions caused by a split in British colonial rule in British India in 1947, and ethnic tensions caused between ethnic groups from British colonial rule until 1947 in Gaza. And now, as of about yesterday, the escalation of this violence by aggressive and unconstitutional actions by the U.S. government, the military, which happened between the time that I wrote this address and this time now that I'm reciting it. Christian response and Christian action in reference to violence is a timely issue. However, writing this, to create this, has been a slow act, and to fact check it and think through all of this. But what is needed right now is clarity of action, economy of words, and decisiveness of character. Slow and deliberate actions rather than initial reactions. And that is what I am writing this to address and reciting this to proliferate in those around me. I recently read Plato's Republic, and this part stood out to me. And the country which was enough to support the original inhabitants will become too small now, and not enough. Quite true. Then a slice of the neighbor's land will be wanted by us for pasture and tillage, and they will want a slice of ours, if, like themselves, they exceed the limit of necessity and give themselves up to unlimited accumulation of wealth. That, Socrates, will be inevitable. And Socrates replies, and so we shall go to war, Glaucon, shall we not? Most certainly, he replied. Colonialism seems to Plato's Socrates like an inexorable attribute of nations. And however indebted me or you are to the concept of our nation, it seems we are also indebted, we are loyal to colonialism. Not God, freedom, or love, but colonialism. I would like to explain why this graven image is ruinous to the image of God in the world, and give an opportunity in the form of information and critical thought to repent for worshiping that idol. There's a number of people who have explicitly denied the genocide in Gaza on my profile, for example, and in conversations in person. And I'm sure there are many more who have not said anything within my online reach, with reservations both to name what is happening in Gaza as genocide and to at all see Israel as a potentially malevolent force. This is, as far as I can tell, motivated by a line of thinking which involves the wrongs that you have been told and you personally perceive have been done to some of the people in the nation of Israel, especially on October 7th, and the right that you believe a nation-state has to enact violence on people to defend its own people. There are a number of propositions implicit in this way of thinking that deserve to be investigated fully by a thoughtful, empathetic, and cosmopolitan Christian. To have the assumption that any one of these ways of being, thoughtful, empathetic, or cosmopolitan, is inconsequential to a Christian is a belief that I cannot convince you to abandon if you don't think any of those things are important, because we don't have any common ground at all. However, most of the people I know share this common ground with me, and if you do believe that a Christian must be thoughtful, empathetic, and cosmopolitan, I will proceed with the thought and investigation that I have done, but now in participation with you, my greater social ecosystem, in hopes to affect a change of our level of Christian action as a constituent of Christian culture toward a belief and activity that is more consistent with toward global violence, less self-contradictory, and more consistent with Christian doctrine in general. So I will attempt to form the argument I believe underlies both a casual apathy toward the genocide in Gaza and implicit support of the violence. The line of thinking we are telling ourselves that we hold, consciously or unconsciously, is this. First, that violence is fundamentally wrong, or unjust is how I'll say it for the rest of this. 2, the people of Gaza, represented by the terrorist organization of Hamas, enacted unjust violence against the people of Israel. 3, Israel, as a nation, has right to defend itself against unjust violence. 4, I can therefore trust in some way that the nation-state of Israel will employ just violence against the people in Hamas, and sometimes Gaza, out of necessity of war, casualties, that sort of thing. And then 5, I do not have to call into question my knowledge of the happenings in Gaza, or contemplate my implicit or explicit support of the Israeli government, or my government that supports it in financial aid and weapons dealings and in other ways. I would like to show the contradictions in this line of thinking we have, and we're telling ourselves we have, and about Christian action, and between this line of thinking that we think we have and the thought and emergent contradictions with the rational corollaries of thought as applied to the genocide in Gaza that we're actually enacting. Then I'll propose a more thoughtful perspective and engagement on the issue that is less dependent on self-contradictory colonial assumptions, anti-Christian theological dogmas, and practices. 1, for the idea that we're telling ourselves that violence is fundamentally wrong, and that this is something that Christians believe. The underlying assumption behind Christian apathy or lack of support for Gaza lies at its base from the fact that the terrorist organization of Hamas enacted violence, and that violence is obviously a wrong thing. However, there's a number of contradictions implicit in the idea that of Christian opposition to violence is fundamentally wrong in any case. I will propose an alternative belief more consistent with Christian action, rather than violence happened and that's bad. There's some context there missing to that idea that is contradictory. In Augustine's The City of God, for the first time in the middle of Christianization of the Roman Empire, or perhaps the imperialization of Christianity under Constantine, Augustine coined the Christian theological concept of a just war. Christianity has involved itself in violence ever since that time, around 300 AD. Constantine's war, a little before that actually, Constantine's war against Maxentius, the Crusades to take Muslim expansion, especially in Jerusalem, back for Christianity, the wars that resulted from in the Protestant Reformation, European colonial violence against approximately 80% of the world, which, by the way, if I have figures or something that should be referenced, I might have it attached as a reference in the caption of this post, in this video, as well as Christian allyship and non-resistance to chattel slavery and violence against African and other minority groups, to name a few interesting, rhetorically, examples. Christianity at large does not believe that violence is fundamentally wrong, and it is no stretch to see that this legacy of approval of violence is directly manifesting in the present Christian engagement with Gaza, or disengagement. And I'll explicate what mechanism is at play there later on. But I'm not here to talk about inherited Christian traditional theology. I'm not here to talk about hermeneutical exegesis of the Bible. That is a discourse that exists quite apart from just normative structures of thought and applied religion in our lives and communities. I would like rather to talk about the beliefs that I believe that you, the viewer, and I, in some ways, also hold at the same time as having a belief that violence is wrong, that contradicts those ideas. Because you, not reason itself or theology or Christianity itself, is what I would like to enrapture with this, with what I'm sharing, with this information. So the first contradiction is that the general Christian approbation of state violence. State violence, to us Christians in general, to us the Christian nation, majority at least until a little while ago, state violence is acceptable. Hippies oppose war. Pacifists are weak. Full-blooded Americans support veterans, the thin blue line, and celebrate when evildoers are brought to justice. The police or militia, as a representative of the state, or to Foucault, the government technology peculiar to the state domains, techniques, and targets where the state intervenes. These, as representatives of the state, have a license to enact violence on individuals by restraining, harming, and in effect kidnapping people into state custody. So police can arrest people, can harm people, and this is done on behalf of the state, or in reference to militia, to kidnap, kill, maim anyone in the world for politically expedient purposes. That it is irrelevant whether you see that as a good thing or not thing, but the violence is still there and legitimated for the reason of it being something from the state, rather than just existing between two people within a territory, like we consider just regular murder. If a military man shoots another man, then he isn't tried in his own country for murder. It's him following orders. And I understand there are cases where that happens, but that's contextualized. It's accepted. In the judicial system, in another example, people are punished carcerally with labor, corporal punishment, up to and including death. We deem this acceptable. We deem this whole arrangement acceptable, and everything it necessitates. Although some Catholics don't like the last point about the death penalty, but most people I've talked to hold it to be a necessary and excusable thing that happens pro re nata. So the state can enact violence on its civilians in certain agreed upon situations, and this is legitimated violence. And not just that, but morally acceptable violence, which is more significant fact. We'll get into the legitimation of violence in a minute. Lastly, we believe that the state can enact violence on soldiers or citizens of other nations in war and deem that to be acceptable. I don't think I need a long proof of that. The Christian reaction to the actions of the U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the actions of the U.S. government via its military in the world wars, that was violence enacted. Obviously, Hitler's like the big bad guy, and so we know violence against Hitler is certainly not fundamentally wrong and evil, but alas, we've excused violence qua violence. Regardless of your opinions about the particulars of various wars, the point stands that almost everyone I've ever met, especially Christians, do believe war qua war is an acceptable action, and state violence toward people of other nations is acceptable. Especially Christians, I believe. Last time I don't remember the exact study, but if I am familiar, I have seen a study where Christians support torture of people of other nations at a higher rate. That was a freebie. We also view passive violence as acceptable. This is what moral philosophy would call a deontological judgment, a way of thinking that cares more about personal culpability and personal values over the fact that people are actually suffering and dying. So if you shoot someone on the street, you are a murderer. If you decide to construct a skyscraper and one of your workers drops a beam on someone, killing them, you are insured. That is accidental death, or at most negligence, but not murder. If you start a health company and you deny someone a claim that they relied on you to provide, and they die as a result of the illness, you are a good businessman. If you are a stock investor of that company, you are a shrewd investor, not a murderer. The culpability does not lie on you, and therefore it's morally illegitimated. These shades of moral ambiguity are arbitrary, as you can tell with those examples, and if your actions cause someone to die, or cause any violence on another person, the difference is a matter of personal values, not a categorically different event if you enact violence on another person passively or actively. The violence remains no matter what you call it. Christians support passive violence. We are okay with driving around in cars and going 80 miles an hour, and hey, every now and then some person's gonna die, and that's just a risk that we have to take because we have to go fast. We are okay with violence that our conceptions of normalcy depend on, especially at a distance from ourselves, and we tend to keep up our normalcy with violence that is then removed from ourselves. As the aforementioned people under oppression of states in prisons, we cannot see the suffering of many people whose suffering that we depend on. We can assume there is violence committed on prisoners, for example, such as bodily restriction in cages or punishments, but these seem acceptable to us, not only because they are state-sanctioned, but because they are out of sight, out of mind. Foucault has a lot to say about this, wrote a book on the subject, so excuse one more quote from him. Punishment leaves the domain of more or less everyday perception and enters that of abstract consciousness. As a result, justice no longer takes public responsibility for the violence that is bound up in its practice. It's not just that we don't think about it much, but that it genuinely doesn't morally matter. We act as if violence committed outside of our view, whether against inmates or people in different countries, from us, distant countries especially, it's not real. We simply choose to not attend to casualties and not think about it and opt for continuation of power relations that uphold the violence. And I've literally been engaged in conversation with people and like talked about people dying, and then the other person was like, well, that's in war, as if like it's no longer an immoral or sad or violent thing to happen, because you could put it in the category of being a war. That kind of sums it up. If we learn of passive violence, state violence, or violence from person to person, and it conflicts with our conception of morality, of normalcy, like the idea that foreign countries are always at war, or criminals must be stopped at some point, or slavery is a necessary practice for the continual growth of the U.S. economy, then we create an intellectual and geographic barrier, like the concept of racism, or the inevitability of the exploitation of the global South for labor, to continue to perceive this violence as acceptable morally. We legitimate violence of various sorts through various means, through more various means. And Susan Sontag wrote a book called Regarding the Pain of Others, a little bit about photography. She writes, kind of mentioning this selective attention. It is felt that there is something morally wrong with the abstract of reality offered by photography, that one has no right to experience the suffering of others at a distance, denuded of its raw power, that we pay too high a human or moral price for those hitherto admired qualities of vision, the standing back from the aggressiveness of the world which frees us for observation and for elective attention. If we are far enough removed from violence, if we have no stake, it truly does not morally matter to us. It doesn't matter. It is not conceived of as evil in the way that violence is conceived of as evil when it relates to us. And it turns out, as I will describe later, relating to us is the whole mechanism for legitimation of violence and political violence in general, at a global scale and structurally. Christians are okay with perceived necessary violences. The last violence is the violence of resistance to evil. The classic example of this is if a man barges in your house and holds a gun to you and your kids and presumably your wife, because you're usually a man in this example, if you do shoot him, you may kill him. Should you shoot him? And Christians would answer this, yes. All of the Christians that I know in my life would answer this, yes. Self-defense is the concept here, albeit selectively applied in our favor, but that could be described as our entire conception of morality. Unfortunately, it does not fully overlap with the golden rule, but the belief of the acceptability of violence against other potential or actual violence underlies the Christian support of not just state violence, like the U.S.'s defense against perceived aggression of Japan at Pearl Harbor, or against the vague ideological structures of communism, but in personal violence, from calling someone names on your Facebook profile, I've never done that, to yelling at the waiter when he gets your order wrong, to tasing someone who's about to assault you for shooting an armed burglar in your house. With varying degrees of social acceptability, the violence itself in these situations, to whatever degree they're deemed necessary to self-defense, are morally acceptable, not evil. They're not wrong. They're good. This tea is Yorkshire Gold. It's good. America's conception was putatively a revolution against oppressive British colonies, an act of self-defense of a state, of a people as a state, as much as self-determination. As the two are inextricably tied, and we take great pride in our 4th of July celebrations, and that wasn't even about violence. We'll get to that later. To kill an evildoer is an occasional tragedy to Christians, occasionally a tragedy to Christians, I should say, but the acceptable kind. One to be prevented by the evildoer, and if he is spared, happens to be an overabundance of kindness to have not been enacted onto him, or her. To American Christians, violence in self-defense, resistance to evil, is not just acceptable, but it is morally good. State violence is acceptable to Christians. Passive violence is acceptable to Christians. Violence that maintains the norm is acceptable to Christians. Violence against perceived evil is acceptable to Christians. Christians do not believe and oppose violence as fundamentally wrong and unacceptable. This is going to be important later, don't worry. As something, it's not denounced as evil, as something that's unacceptable that must be stamped out at all costs. That all choices must be chosen first, not just first, but but as a prime directive, that all action must be bound up in as to ensure that it is not a possibility. To have an example of that, no bank robberies have ever been committed by a group of people completely dedicated to not robbing a bank. If we really didn't want to kill people, we'd find a way. The Jainists do a pretty good job of it, covering their mouths so flies don't fly in there and they accidentally kill them. For example, it's a religion, Jainism, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Christians very much support, as morally proper, state, passive, necessary, and self-protective violence. If they did believe and enact that violence is fundamentally wrong, as we are telling ourselves we do, especially in extreme violence, Christians would decry and equally denounce violence from Hamas and the violence of the apartheid state of Israel. Do everything in their power to prevent any further violence of any kind, and stop paying taxes to a government that supports one of the actors of violence at the exclusion of the other. In other words, Christians would work toward making peace. This may be a preferable reality, but one that is very far away. Instead, Christians may have thoughts like, well, Israel shouldn't be cruel, or it's always bad when people suffer, or like, we want peace in the Middle East, or I hope they minimize civilian casualties. Nobody probably has that discrete thought. But these thoughts are generated to only appease our own consciences, and are grossly inconsistent with our actions and actual beliefs. Instead of decrying violence unilaterally, the violence of Hamas against the people of Israel is decried as wrong, both in Christian behavior and as an assumption in discourse, and as support for the nation of Israel as a concept, and as an enacted behavior, and therefore excuse and encourage in any potential discourse that would raise the possibility of the military or people of Israel committing violence against Hamas, or even the people of Gaza is trivialized to the point of apathy. This is the support of violence in one direction, the one that we actively prefer. That is not a denunciation of violence. Acts of violence against Israeli people are perceived, attended to, processed as unacceptable, and engaged across power relations while maintaining a comfortable level of personal disengagement from the issue. And acts of violence against Palestinian people and the people that are in Hamas are excused as acceptable and generally unattended to, as in that information is going to be selected out quite quickly, and sometimes grossly. Holding, at least in my experience talking to people about this, as in very starkly, holding that any violence against Israel on behalf of Palestine is inexcusable, while even some violence toward Palestinians is acceptable, is not consistent with the idea that Christians supposedly have toward violence, but it is consistent with the actual belief Christians hold, being that violence from weaker to more powerful or equally powerful bodies is always fundamentally wrong and unjust. This is more in, if you are familiar with Plato's Republic, Thrasymachus's view of justice in the Republic. It was different from Socrates'. He believed that justice is just the benefit of the powerful, and Christians hold and practice the social and culturally convenient belief that violence may only flow down one's personal perspective of political power relations. Israel's murder of 54,510 people as of June 2nd, when I started writing this, according to WHO, again, I have references on there for all of this, an example of, those murders are not viewed as morally evil. They're viewed as legitimate or acceptable, but that's another point I'll argue later in terms of how they're structurally legitimated. An example of this enacted belief is the fact that state violence is viewed as acceptable, and the state possesses more power than individual bodies, and so state violence against individuals is legitimated morally. Another example is that passive violence is coded as acceptable in discourse because in the power relations between acting or non-acting subject, this is an example of Christians accepting as morally passive violence because of power relations implicit in that dynamic. There's a power differential based off of the difference between a non-acting subject and a victim that is related to the event that enacts violence on that individual. Same as the systems of normalcy, where those who fall outside or in opposition to a power system, for example, like America, have violence enacted against them, and then the people in America support that version of normalcy. So, for example, we've always supported Israel, and that's what we're going to keep doing, keeping up the normal, and keep believing that Israel is a non-malevolent power, and that people aren't dying in a non-legitimate way. Another specific example of this is the Christian support and apathy toward violence committed against African peoples during the time of chattel slavery and Jim Crow, and modern relations between people in power and people of African descent. Or Christian support and acceptability of violence enacted from normalizing patriarchal roles, which then leads to coercion, unequal levels of violence against women and people identifying as women. and Christian support of colonial violence in general, which we'll get to later. But in short, these all contribute, as you could probably take one step further with all of that. For example, passive violence. If we don't do anything about, let's say, if there is a genocide in the Middle East, there is. If we don't do anything, it will continue, and that action of inaction is not immoral. And we could do that with all of those different dimensions. That rather than a theological or Christ-informed view, the Christian position is, and has always been, that the powerful can and should enact violence over the weak, but not the weak toward the stronger, or two equal people, such as entities with equal rights, for example. Colonies resisting their imperialist oppressors, women asserting their autonomy, rioting on behalf of African bodies, violence of slavery rebellions, or violence in pursuit of civil rights like the Black Panthers or Malcolm X, is viewed as wrong and morally unacceptable and evil from the oppressor class. We citizens of America and Israel, like our constituents of a particular Western European imperial enterprise, which spans national borders and party lines and is a particular structure of shared power. America and Israel are financially and politically entwined in a Western imperial hegemony. So violence against America and Israel is then perceived as wrong due to that concept, the conceptual framework. As in, it is... Oh, I lost my place. It is evil because of the predicate of being anti-oppression and not evil as such, unsafe. So, which is why killing Saddam Hussein is a we got him, and the act of 9/11 is not just violent wrong, it is evil. Not because it was unprovoked, which I'll get into this later, but because we determine other unprovoked actions as morally, by the way, we consider other unprovoked actions as morally acceptable, which I'll exemplify later. Or I'll exemplify it right now, like the imperialist conquest of Israel on occupied land, or Israel's aggression against Iran, which doesn't seem to be swaying any more Christian voices against Israel, and it isn't about civilian casualties, 9/11, which I'll exemplify more later. But take 9/11 and the related U.S. invasion of Iraq as an example. 9/11 was terror and immoral, whereas the 3,500 or so U.S. civilian deaths, let me start that one sentence over. 9/11 was terror, where about 3,500 or so U.S. civilian deaths occurred between September 11th attacks and Al-Qaeda's bombing of two foreign national embassies. Whereas the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which involved the murder of around 100 to 300,000 Iraqi civilians, that is morally acceptable and defensible. And if there are civilian deaths in both instances, the civilian deaths are not the operative variable. It's not what predicts whether violence is viewed as morally evil or necessary. There's a little bit more to the story of what legitimates violence morally. But as for moral judgments, it seems that the perceived status of political power, for example, an American person is more valuable in our minds than, for example, a Vietnamese person, or a British person or government is more powerful and central and therefore valuable than an Indian person or government. But two non-Western countries like China and Taiwan have relatively similar values, unless we see stakes of Western political power in them, which was a case of America's aggression in Vietnam. But there's a small strain of Christian thought that does actually hold the idea that violence is inherently wrong. Woohoo! As a way of being or conceptual framework in Tolstoy's religious writings and Anabaptist Christianities, and as a discrete concept in early Christian writings and Desert Fathers. You can find that sort of concept in Tertullian, Irenaeus, Arnobius, Justin Martyr, Origen, Cyprian, I suppose, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, Abba Anthony, some Desert Fathers there. These beliefs, which I would appropriate Tolstoy's term of calling it non-resistance to evil, that would result in a non-contradictory application of the apparent beliefs of violence being wrong into action, which I mentioned before would result in peacemaking, decrying violence with one's voice, opposition to the government that supports them, and direct action and financial aid to prevent and heal and render impossible further suffering of everybody experiencing suffering. The action would not be apathetic support of the powerful state expedient to American empire over weak colonized peoples. Number two, second thought. in what we Christians believe about Gaza is that the people of Gaza, represented by the terrorist organization of Hamas, enacted unjust violence against the people of Israel. That the violence occurred on October 7th by Hamas was unjust violence. That is the second idea that we were telling ourselves. It was unjust, presumably, because it hurts innocent civilians, and it was uncalled for. This is what Christians would likely verbalize as a rationalization for the actions being unjust. I wish to investigate these two elements of what we are telling ourselves. First, that violence against civilians is unjustified. We perceive October 7th, the murder, injuring, or kidnapping of 1,200 or so combined Israeli defense forces and civilians as an unjust action we cannot support. 1,200 combined Israeli defense forces and civilians. Approximately 30 children were kidnapped by Hamas. And because we care about innocent children, and we believe nobody should commit extreme violence against people, especially innocent people, we must oppose not just Hamas, but the Palestinians that Israel is fighting, and unilaterally support the occupying nation state of Israel and fighting back against whatever is causing and supporting the violence. Except we do not actually believe that extreme violence against innocent children is unjust, much less violence against innocent people or violence against anyone. That is the first contradiction to the idea that we're telling ourselves. Because if Christians did have a problem with extreme violence for children, they would be interested in, as well, those 41 innocent children killed by Israeli forces in occupied Palestine in 2022, a full year before the October 7th attacks. By the way, in the same year, 27 combined Israelis, citizens and non-citizens, were killed by Palestinians. This is a good time to mention false balance, or both sides-ism, which is a form, both sides-ism. It's a form of misinformation which unequal measures are perceived as equal due to biases in reporting. What this means is there's some sicko that lives in all of us that when I said 41 children died in occupied Palestine by assaults by Israeli military forces, there is a sicko in your head that will react by saying, and what did Palestine do to deserve that? Or, how many Israelis died? That's why I gave you that number of 27 in general. But how many Israelis died does not make it okay that 41 children were killed. You don't have to think that Israel, the reason that you would think that is so you didn't have to think that Israel has done anything morally wrong or illegitimate. There it is. So that you don't have to question your prior assumptions, so you do not have to think. That is what the little guy in your head is saying. So if you're wondering, there were over 200 people that died in occupied Palestine, 40 of them being children, and your brain goes, how many people died in Israel? The answer is about 30. Although I don't know exactly what number you'd be looking for, or what number would like legitimate the deaths, just one, or perhaps like 10 times as many. But the question isn't really what you're asking, and you're not looking for a ratio. It's just a cognitive bias that you're using to absolve yourself of guilt of thinking about the situation. The question you're actually asking is it okay that 41 children were killed, innocent children, because there's no such thing as a non-innocent child, were killed in occupied Palestine? I'm telling you, if we had an ounce of the morals that we think we have, we would be asking different questions. The answer is no, it does not legitimate that. The contradiction insinuates that the rhetoric about This contradiction insinuates that the rhetoric about Israeli child hostages and saving the children, as saving children so often is merely just leverage as a rhetorical device to justify murdering more children. So it's pretty self-contradictory right there. Using one murder to excuse another, not in a courtroom or on some kind of cosmic scale, but as a means of justifying our complicity to ourselves. It's a cognitive mechanism as a means of perpetuating our own ignorance. The reality is that 30 Israeli people dying is a tragedy, and it is wrong. It does not negate that 200 people dying is also a tragedy, and almost 10 times more of a tragedy, especially when you factor in political dynamics, like occupation. But that comes later. What is important right now is that when you hear me describing death for the rest of this address, the fact that you do not care about dying people, you don't start the script that allows you to not care about dying children and dying people. I am here to interrupt that cognitive mechanism and make you think. That's why I'm doing this. Not only that, but if we did care about innocent children being murdered, we would view the actions of Hamas on October 7th as unjustified, yes. And we would hold that the 11,355 children, as of me starting to write this, the settler nation state of Israel has murdered since that attack. We would not hold them equally. That's both sidesism, as I have mentioned. We would certainly not privilege the speck over the log. We would hold those deaths, all of them, as a tragedy. The deaths of innocent children, all children, are horrific. 36 Israeli children being murdered on October 7th is horrific, and 11,000 Palestinian children being murdered is horrific. Yet, we Christians willingly and unilaterally support a political entity that's murdering children and committing this terror with greater efficiency and zeal than the terrorist group is. I'll define the support explicitly later in the address, but for the sake of this argument, understand that Christians do not oppose the nation-state of Israel. This should be an obvious fact, and its people murdering babies. We relish in the fact to the point of apathy. We enjoy that fact so much that we're willing to not care about it. We do not believe violence against innocent civilians is wrong. We are perfectly willing to accept children being murdered in certain contexts. We just care what children are being killed by whom. As Susan Sontag says, my next point will be to explain what those contexts are in which not that violence is seen as morally acceptable, as in the last point, but as legitimated as an action that can be supported regardless of moral resonances. So the difference between legitimation and something as morally evil or not, the difference would be structural preference rather than just an intellectual moral reckoning. So what is actually enacted structurally. Which usually would go hand in hand, but not always, I found. The moral mechanism with which Christians decide whether extreme violence is acceptable or not, and then the conceptual mechanism that makes them structurally and across power relations prefer one to the other. What makes them legitimate violence towards civilians is not the number of deaths of civilians or the kinds of deaths of civilians. Casualties can basically be regarded as in completely periphery causal factor. I mean this technically, if you've been following my argument, they are not causally tied in any way to our perceptions. We don't give a shit about dead children. You do not, technically speaking, exactly speaking, care about dead children, and that's something that you're enacting in support of Israel. It's not an insult, it's a fact about how Christianity and you nested within Christianity interact with other people. It's in not implicitly caring about dead children, it is actually actively being uncaring about dead children, technically speaking. Perhaps self-defense. Maybe that's the legitimation mechanism for what violence we would support and not support. For example, the earlier example of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq was justified based off the idea of self-defense from the terrorists endangering the lives of the people of the U.S. So, self-defense against supposed terror might be a salient concept. But then again, not always, and this proves to be at most an intermediary and as a causal determinant, or to the causal determinant. One of the central aspects of our history, for example, is the U.S. revolution, hallelujah, the U.S.'s revolution from the colonizing power of Great Britain, which was violent at times toward the U.S. colonies, as all occupations are for the people being occupied, but the revolution is known historically to have been violence on behalf of independence and representation and self-governance. Self-determination, not as a response to extreme existentially threatening violence, imminent violence toward a people. So we see legitimate violence based off colonial dynamics from colonized people as legitimate. And yet, the current actions of the nation-state of Israel, using them as an example, we see violence legitimated by an occupying power to occupied peoples in putative self-defense of the colony, in some ways analogous to Great Britain's part in the Revolutionary War. So neither the brand of casualties nor the occupied status are the primary legitimation of power, or, for example, an aggressive or defending country, which we'll get into later. In fact, acts of terror against civilians were a feature of the Revolutionary War from Americans, which we, of course, legitimate. Terror against governments in general from state or non-state bodies is not the delegitimizing mechanism. Again, if we felt that, we would also delegitimate all other violence in these other cases. This can also be seen by U.S. support and Christian civilian support of violence toward foreign coups and civil wars, which have all been fundamentally, over time, supported in their respective times. Obviously, like, people feel differently about the Vietnam War after it's happened, but alas, the hippies were right. Maybe. So, we have the question, what makes Hamas's violence toward the occupying state of Israel not legitimated, but legitimates American violence against Great Britain? In both cases, there is violence and political and other oppression from the colonizing power. In both cases, the colonizer is part of a European hegemony. In both cases, the colonizer is in a politically stronger position, militaristically stronger position. However, in the case of the Revolutionary War, the U.S. was defending their own European Western Empire, whereas Palestinians are defending an indigenous, non-Western, non-white, quote-unquote, people. I said the Great Britain was in a militaristically more powerful position. I guess I don't mean that exactly, because the idea of, like, the supply chain across the sea and that sort of thing. But you get the idea of, as far as political hegemony is concerned. In other words, American violence is legitimated because violence is enacted from American-looking people in a way that benefits American empire. So if you're an American Christian, you're going to legitimate violence based off of whether it is expedient for the American empire by people that are American-ish enough, or against people that are less American-ish. And Hamas violence is delegitimated because it flows from racialized bodies to more European bodies and violates the interests of Western imperialism. In cases where violence is delegitimated against an occupying power that is European and has a greater political power, is another case of that is the case of enslaved African peoples in the U.S., where violent slave revolts were squashed and viewed by Christians as violations of God's natural order, and slaves were encouraged to peacefully obey their masters. The commonality here is that enslaved peoples are not ethnically European or passing as such, and were not part of the Americanized political and social hegemony, and fighting against their oppressors very much harmed American empire as it was at the time. According to the people there, I don't think it's harmed it long term. I think it would have been better to have not done that. Anyway, an example of violence being legitimate in similar circumstances is the Nicaraguan Revolution, where America supported the majority white Somoza family over the FSLN, the Sandistas, in a way that benefited American imperial power, which Christians supported, by the way. The legitimation of violence seems to follow the contours of racialization as a metaphor of American imperial interests, certainly not the contours of moral considerations of nations and their people. So the idea of whether violence is morally wrong or not is not the legitimation of what makes one support violence or not support violence. It's perceived racial differences as a mechanism of determining benefit to American imperialism, in other words, imperialism of one's own benefit or not. Unjust political violence is that, to define it, unjust political violence is that which opposes the self-interest of Western imperial powers, especially when exemplified by perceived quote-unquote race differences. Race is a construct that was used to justify this sort of violence and oppression of other people. That's why I use the quotes, and refer to ethnicities rather than races, because those aren't discrete biological categories. As is apparent, the reality of what we are enacting and believing isn't that extreme violence is unjust when against innocence at all, or even an imbalance of innocent deaths. If we thought that might be a little bit more useful than what we do think, or aggressive instigation of violence like Israel's conquest of occupied Palestine, causing innocent non-civilian deaths and escalation, nor resistance against colonizing powers like in the Revolutionary War. Rather, What defines unjust violence is any violence enacted against white imperialism. That is the theology that Christianity enacts in belief and action. If Christians did believe extreme violence against innocent civilians is unjust, we would be working to support a peaceful end to the nation-state of Israel's colonial project in the region and a release of the hostages, rather than a continued Zionist expansionism and murder of civilians in Gaza. 3. Let me take a tea. There's a bug in there. 3. Israel as a nation has a right to defend itself against unjust violence. There are contradictions implicit in the idea that the nation of Israel has a right to defend itself with relation to what's happening in Gaza, the genocide. The first contradiction is that given the assumption that states have a right to defend themselves and their people against violence, Palestinians have a right to defend Palestine has a right to defend itself, which would insinuate that Hamas's actions, which were certainly in defense of, or intended in the defense of the state of Palestine from Israel's military and political occupation of the state of Palestine and its people, as well as the violence enacted against them, particularly the oppression and violence that always accompanies colonization, and the threat, this is the interesting part, that occupation serves toward a state's independent and autonomous existence, which is what an occupation is. So Hamas was acting in defense of Palestine as a state, as a concept, and as a people. So I've attached some sources to all of these, but the sorts of violence, since I'm referencing it now, like torture, physical abuse, and unnecessary force against people and children during arrests, or in other times, excessive force, murder of protesters, fatalities, no, I don't know what that was. That was a link I started reading. Murder of Palestinian civilians by Israeli military occupation. And yes, this is all before October 7th. Might also be a good time to say, here's a little aside, a commercial break. If you're unfamiliar with the terminology of occupation or settling, if you're taking issue to these terms because they seem a little scary or uncomfortable, or unfamiliar, I should say, or liberal, they're not liberal categories, they're political terms, and you have resources at your disposal to learn about settler colonialism. There's a book by Caroline Elkins, Legacy of Violence, A History of British Empire. There's a book by Sari Nusseibeh called Once Upon a Country. There's a book by Rashid Khalidi called The 100 Years War on Palestine, which is about this in particular, and another one about this case in particular is Ilan Pappé's very short history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thomas Hobbes's The Leviathan is a political, philosophical text that describes colonialism in some ways. There's a book called Settler Colonialism by Patrick Wolfe, The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism is a really in-depth book that goes and describes some of the origins of the Zionist conferences and relevant colonial enterprises that ended in Israel as a colonial project to fix the problem of Jewish people existing, which is only problematized based off of the concept of European ethno-states, which, surprisingly, Israel is an intended ethno-state. If you look at the Constitution or Declaration of Independence, whatever the founding document is, it describes Jews in particular, not all peoples. As Americans, like, we believe all people have a whatever under God, which of course we selectively applied that, but at least the words were there. Israel does not have that yet. There's also a short text by David Gruhl called From Turtle Island to Gaza. But this is just all to say, it's not a disputed fact that Israel is occupying Palestine as a colonial power. It's just what there are settlers of Palestinian occupied land, and then the occupied land. It's not like I'm making some kind of point by saying that is the correct terminology. But then again, it's also correct to describe what happened in Palestine, of the partition plan, etc., of Israel coming and taking the land as conquest, and describing the people leaving in on Nakba. About 700,000 Palestinians left their place that they were living, their land, and moved. That's ethnic cleansing. And what's happening right now is genocide, a certain ethnicity being targeted and murdered systematically, especially civilians, that sort of thing, and apartheid. These are technical terms that have been, we'll get into that. But yes, this is to say that at least those ideas of colonialism and occupation are not contested elements of the discourse. I can foresee viewers that I know watching this and going, I don't know what the hell colonialism is, and that sounds like some weird hippie crap. Yeah, I mean, like, hippies might have been using that language and Marxists and stuff like that, but so do like academic scholars and stuff. We just don't tend to be very familiar with that kind of thing, because like, who the crap reads that crap? People that have a need to. Anyway, we don't believe nations have a right to defend themselves from violence and imminent existential threat. We don't think that that's something, because if we did, we'd be applying it unilaterally to both states. If we did believe that nations and peoples have a right to defend themselves, we would legitimate violent resistance of Hamas against Israeli occupation and violence, and not just legitimate Israelis' putative self-defense. More relevantly, we would legitimate violence against military conquest of the region, as well as conquest through settler colonialism after the 6 Days War in 1967 in particular. That would necessitate self-defense and would thereby invalidate the nation-state of Israel's right to exist at all. I'm not saying that that's what I think. I'm saying that's what you would think if you felt like nations had a right to defend themselves. I don't think that. But whatever. That would be a self-consistent understanding of the rights of nation-states that have a right to defend themselves and their people. Again, it would seem self-defense doesn't come into the causal equation. What the operative variable among the legitimation or problematization of violence is perceived threat to Western white hegemony, which is the us, even if the them, is acting in self-defense. Not just is this displayed by Christian delegitimization of the Hamas's violence on October 7th, but in the U.S.'s support of the military aggression in, for example, the Spanish-American War or the Operation Just Cause in Panama. And yes, Christian support of those actions. I should say invasions. But the operative factor is not who aggressed and who is defending, and it is not the method of violence nor who is experiencing that violence, but whether the particular violence committed furthers white Western imperialism, which, again, to define a term very loosely, because I didn't prep this beforehand, but imperialism is the idea of an empire, the concepts of expansionism, and then just a general concept of like a nation, or a nation, for example, and all of its interests, and everything that would go into that would be an empire. So if the U.S. has an oil rig in China, then like that little oil rig is part of the U.S. empire. And the desire to make an oil rig in China that somebody in the U.S. owns, that then benefits everybody else in the U.S., that is imperialism. We just did political philosophy, which I don't know anything about. I'm just using these terminologies because they're accurate. So I'm not an expert. I might have gotten that totally wrong in my example, but that's probably good enough for working knowledge. Anyway, let me get down to this, because we're almost done. As one more contradiction in the self-consistency of the idea that we're telling ourselves, the nation-state of Israel is not defending itself. That is not what's happening. It is enacting ethnic cleansing in furtherance of its settler colonial project in the area, escalating the colonial enterprise and the tensions that stem from conquest and colonialism. It is not working toward peace. If you were trying to defend yourself, you would be attempting to get the violence to stop happening towards you, not trying to get it more so you can legitimate your own violence. But proliferating conflict and endangering its own people, especially hostages. And there are multiple examples of this happening, specifically in specific cases where peace was very much an option for this area, for Israel. But that is engaging in the particulars, where I really just want to focus on the fact of what Israel is doing in general. If the nation-state of Israel sends troops to kill members of Hamas, perhaps that would be self-defense. To be exact, if the government cripples Hamas's ability to resist the Israeli government violently, that would be possibly self-defense. But the Israeli government sending troops to murder, displace, and starve Palestinian civilians is not self-defense. Palestinian civilians are not Hamas. The UN's Human Rights Office has confirmed 70% of total verified deaths being of women and children. Children are not Hamas. Children might be Hamas someday, and then you could use that idea, and I don't know, maybe there's people out there doing this, that ethnic cleansing is your only option for survival. And that would be true if you live in an ethno-state, which Interesting idea. Murdering 60,000 Palestinians is not getting rid of Hamas, nor making peace in the region. That is committing systematic terror and extreme violence on civilians of a certain ethnicity, moving an ethnic group out of a region. That is not making peace or defending yourself. That is expansionism. It's ethnic cleansing with colonial motives. It's escalating conflict with surrounding Arabic nations in an attempt to expand one's empire, with the tacit and explicit support and violent support, aggressive support of the U.S., which has been, okay, we'll keep going. If Palestinians are murdered by the state of Israel, that is not self-defense. That's the point. Children do not pose a threat to anybody. Children do not pose a threat to anybody. Here's another one for the heuristics in your brain, which will likely play out. Hamas has committed violence against Israel. Congrats. Violence against Palestinian civilians is not self-defense. If I am robbed at gunpoint by some woman, and as a response, I go to the nearest yoga class and shoot everybody in it, that is not self-defense. That's insanity. This is insanity. The way we're thinking about this and supporting this is insanity. If a single Palestinian person dies, the actions Israel is committing is not self-defense. They are not. Much less tens of thousands of direct and intentional acts of murder of civilians. There's no percentage of Hamas members being killed that would legitimate the murder of unrelated Palestinian civilians. That is not a legitimate means of violence if you believe the idea that only from the idea that nations have a right to defend themselves against bodies that are going to enact terror on them. That's what self-defense means. Again, I didn't operationally define that, but I'm pretty sure we can basically use, for example, this example. If I were to defend myself against this woman who's robbing me at gunpoint, I might shoot her at most, but probably not all the women in the world. That would be weird. Or I wouldn't racially profile her and say, I'm going to kill all the white women in the area and take their homes. That's not self-defense. Okay. So, what we really believe is not that Israel has the right to defend itself. We've exemplified that. But that the nation-state of Israel has a right to kill anyone indigenous to Palestine when the imperial project started. If we actually believed states had the right to self-defense, we would legitimate violence toward the colonial state of Israel during its imperial conquest of the region in 1948 or 47, as this was the original aggression to the region. Well, not original, original in the context of Israel. There was colonial violence already, and the Civil War toward British colonialism. Surprise, the British are involved, and that is obviously at the origin, the conception of Israel is when self-defense was necessitated, and we would not be legitimating that conquest as it necessitates self-defense if we believe that self-defense is necessary. Okay, we're getting there. Almost done. 75% of the way done. 4. I can therefore trust in some way that the nation-state of Israel will employ just violence against the people in Hamas, and maybe sometimes Gaza if necessary. There's a contradiction implicit in the idea that we do simply place trust in Israel to commit appropriate, precise, and just violence in Hamas and sometimes Gaza because of casualties, which again is a category we just accept. But there's a contradiction in applying that to how we act and actually think, in the idea that we simply are placing trust in Israel, that we have that preference, and trust is an initial state, and if taking the contrary, trust is an initial state. It's a state that you're in, a way of relating. And if taking the contradictory statements preceding this one, we might tell ourselves that we can, in some ways, trust Israel to not enact violence that is unjust, in the way that Hamas's violence is certainly unjust. If we're taking all of those assumptions that we are telling ourselves, we would end up in this area of basically trusting that Israel is the good guy or something, and will probably do whatever they should. And we might even actively work toward propagating propaganda that is actively supporting Israel's actions in military actions as far as it concerns what we do with our votes, tax dollars, discourses about the nation of Israel. However, this is contradictory in that a trusting person would not be combative or resistant to changing her mind. She would take no interest, perhaps, in the idea that Israel might be committing atrocities, but when presented with the information that these things are happening, it is not a matter of trust to eschew facts, contrary to their initial trust. That is a matter of motivated reasoning and delusion. A wife trusts her husband if she doesn't arbitrarily think that he's cheating on her out of, like, with no information presented, and even it's trusting to just be resistant to the idea. But if she was seeing her husband cheating on another woman, and if everyone around her, if there was a global discourse about her husband cheating on her, it wouldn't be a trusting thing to 100% delegitimate that and then act in defiance of interest and act in complete apathy of that information. That is not trust. That is motivation to not see something, or delulu. That is not trust in a single power, but apathy of human life in general, and that's what that's displaying. What we really believe is this: I do not care whether or not human life is subject to extreme violence in Palestine on behalf of Israel. That is the behavior that Christians are enacting. We Christians are enacting. If we trusted the nation state of Israel to not commit unjust violence, we would change our mind when presented with independent journalism, political scholarship, and various trusted third-party reports of war crimes and crimes against humanity, of apartheid, genocide, targeting of children, civilians, blocking safe humanitarian aid to children, targeting journalists and aid workers, and committing ethnic cleansing from Doctors Without Borders, the UN's Human Rights Commission, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Human Rights First, Red Cross, UNICEF, the International Criminal Court, the Vatican. A person with an implicit bias toward Israel a priori, when confronted with a global discourse on the horrors happening in the region, would minimally attend to the possibility that they are true. We're not doing even that. American Christians I know and love, and a majority that I do not know, have no interest to engage the information at all. They have no interest in the sanctity of human life, period. I shared pictures of starving children on my Facebook profile, which, yeah, like, Facebook doesn't bring out the best of people. Well, this is a great exemplification of that, because somebody commented, how do you know these photos are real? And I went and tracked down the origin of every photo. I reverse searched them. I found the independent journalist and the various news sources that were posting them. I found corroborating videos and other photos in different places of these same children to show they're not AI or something. I don't know why you'd think random pictures that don't look AI in any way are AI. Somebody else also came and then that person just left and said, hey, I have no interest in I don't like your tone very much, I'm not talking to you. And at no point took responsibility for the fact that they just they just called into question a bunch of pictures of actual children that are starving to death, which, like, isn't even like a disputed idea of that's something that's been happening. And then somebody else was saying that's something that's from some civil war, which is just it isn't. And which I was like, look, I tracked it down. They don't care. These two individuals that are Christians in my area that I know well had no interest in the fact of whether it was true or not, and that is what they enacted with their behavior. That was the thing. That's despicable to me. So all the times that we do seem to have interest in the sanctity of human life as Christians emerge as political interests, not compassion. Think abortion, human trafficking, the eternal destiny of people's souls that we're so darn concerned about. There's nothing selfless in a religion that has no interest in human life. Those are political conveniences and supporting one's own Christian empire. Very obviously sometimes. Here's another one for your brain. Complexity bias. Here's another commercial break. Complexity bias is a cognitive bias to substitute a simple situation into something that is too nuanced, and it's taking a simple situation and believing that it is too complicated and too nuanced to possibly think about, so that way you don't have to think about it. Well, obviously, if a situation is complicated, that fact does not absolve you of the responsibility to think clearly and conclusively about it. It is only It only operates, it's not rational at all, it only operates as a reactive mechanism for feeling absolved of the necessity to think about that thing, that simple situation. This situation is not complicated if you are non-contradictory with your assumptions. The only thing complicated about it is like what in Revelation might be meaning that Israel is the secret good guy the whole time, and if they kill all the other countries in the world, then all the Jews will become Christians, and then God will come back and kill everybody, and that'll be really good. That's complicated. That's the implicit eschatology in a lot of people, in a lot of people's like late 1900s theologies that like stuck on to people. I don't know. I didn't read that Bible, but that. This situation is not complicated if you are non-contradictory with your assumptions, and that is what this address is hopefully helping you with. Here's something very uncomplicated. 60,000 people have been murdered in Gaza. Thinking about other times people have died does not complicate that. If you say something like 60,000 people have died in Gaza and an Israeli died in Israel, that doesn't complicate the fact that that 60,000 people have been murdered. If 60,000 people have been murdered because that happened, it doesn't change the fact that 60,000 people have been murdered, and that's something that should be avoided. That's a bad thing. It doesn't make it a good thing because some other person somewhere was also murdered. It means it's doubly bad. How is that complicated? So the good reasons that might or might not exist for murdering all those people, which, by the way, there are none, does not complicate that fact. Death, supported and financed and expedient to us, that makes things get real complicated real quick, because it takes a big toll to think about things that are expedient to us even when it's something like death. If you want to know ways Gazan deaths benefit us as Christians and as Americans, then that's a whole other video, but we can get into that if somebody's ready to roll. But it is certainly not too complicated to conceptualize. It is too tragic to ignore. That excuse is dead and dumb. That's just so stupid. That's obviously a cognitive mechanism for not handling things, to say, oh yeah, the Middle East, it's always been at war, it will always be at war. It's too complicated. There are too many factors. It doesn't complicate the fact that 60,000 people have been killed, and the circumstances in which they've been killed, and the fact that it's expedient to you and me. I'm sure slave owners could not see how they'd run their plantations without the lie of black people existing, because they could not see themselves as anything other than slaveholders. That does not absolve them of guilt. We know that now. It reveals their complicity, as with us. We're not enacting simple trust in a familiar political power. We are enacting and believing in disregard and disinterest in human life and human suffering. Number 5. This is the last idea that we're telling ourselves, that I do not have to call into question my knowledge of the happenings of Gaza, or contemplate my implicit or explicit support of the Israeli government, or my government that supports it with financial aids and weapons dealings and other forms. There's a contradiction in the idea that one is removed enough from this conflict that one's participation is actively and passively non-negligible. Here's a list of some of the ways Christian Americans, in other ways other than this idea, currently support the state of Israel's violence. Willingly paying taxes to a government that financially supports Israel and does not censure or sanction them, and allows billions of dollars of weapons deals to go to Israel. Christians willingly stay silent rather than protesting or posting and thus proliferating discourses about the suffering of Palestinians. That is why me and my wife started wearing this keffiyeh, which is a scarf from the area, to proliferate discourses about the area and what's happening. We don't want to convince people to our side in an undue way with these scars. It wouldn't convince anybody. We want to talk about it because people aren't talking about it, because it's inconvenient to talk about deaths that are expedient to oneself, that you're delegitimating in improper and contradictory ways. Anyway, so conversations are good. Another way is inertia, just being willingly a part of the wall of anti-intellectual and anti-human theologies and cognitive biases and assumptions that are continuing intellectual support of Israel and proliferating these biases and assumptions. and thus contributing to the majority of Christians complicit in Israel and the inertia of all other Christians not speaking up. So, in other words, it compounds on itself to remain ignorant. Sending money to various causes or personal expenses rather than aid to Palestinians, not writing local representatives for an arms embargo or allowance of humanitarian aid consistent with international law, as in humanitarian aid that is implemented consistently with international law, rather than a little trap to shoot people in, which is what we're getting. Which was what we do now, but I'm getting sidetracked there, so we'll just keep moving. Or creating a disruption that would contribute to political change on behalf of Palestine. That's what Christians would be engaging in if they did support people unilaterally, and that reveals their support of Israel by inaction or action. Using money to patronize businesses that support Israel in its actions financially, and then as with hidden state violence, with Israel's colonial violence, preservation by any means is chosen over speaking truth to power, acting against empire, or changing beliefs for the violence. Over the course of various power relations across our lives, from whatever position of power we occupy, whatever power we have to implement things, we are using to support Israel in its actions, which is not what you do with things that you find to be detestable, like genocide should be for us, which I've had a number of conversations with multiple Christians in which they do not believe genocide is something that is morally reprehensible. And again, as for one of my statements at the beginning, I don't know about my common ground with somebody that thinks that genocide is something that is morally ambiguous. So these are the contradictions, that we know what we support matters, that we know what we say matters, and we know what we do matters. We do not act despite having access to information, and access to information of what is happening, and whether it is unjust or not. We know we are not perfect. It's in our theology. We know that we must change our minds, but Christians remain unmoved from the initial propaganda they swallowed in 1948 about the British colonial project in mandatory Palestine as being something that's legitimate to change hands to Zionists, and for the colonized people that lived in Palestine to not be recognized as existing or relevant, as colonial powers had done since the beginning of that being a thing. So it's not a rarity. It's not like a disputed fact that colonial powers have done that again and again and again over, again, 80% of the world. We know that we have to call into question our actions. This is the contradiction, and we do not do it selectively when it benefits us. That is the contradiction. If we did not think that we had to call into question our complicity, we would not be calling to defund Planned Parenthood and going to charities to stop human trafficking. And it happens, but it happens a lot more in legitimate ways than illegitimate ways. Some people know what I'm talking about there. Or going to church and community to hear and spread the good news. We wouldn't be caring about that sort of thing because we wouldn't find ourselves as salient existences, moral existences. We would not believe in good in some, and we would not be trying to promulgate it. However, and it is usually selfishly and ineffectually we do. But we do, because we believe in love. We just do not believe in love for Palestinians. What we actually believe is that Palestinian life is not valuable nor worth protecting or caring about, at the very least in this context. I'm not saying this as a general sociological statement of but a diagnosis of your engagement with Gaza as a Christian. I'm talking to you. I'm not saying that Christians in general conceive of blah blah blah. I'm saying that when you enact across your various power relations over the course of your life support of Israel in the various ways that I've just mentioned, when you engage in philo-Semitism, like having a menorah in your home and supporting a Zionist state, and then those things have to do with each other for some reason, you are actively enacting uncaring and unloving and hate. You are enacting hate and violence toward Palestinian peoples. Aha! You may feel guilty when I said all that crap, and there may be a reactive little boy in your brain saying, well, Noah, you are also bad and mean, and you also support violence. Great. Maybe you've got me. my clothes were probably made by slaves, and I'm mean to people on Facebook, and perhaps and perhaps not that is all true, and maybe I'm the like second perfect person in the world, but maybe not. There's a wasp. He senses my evil. However, my personal guilt or bad behavior does nothing to remove the blot of your own hateful complicity. I wish that it did cancel yours out, but it does not. I wish I could get rid of the genocide that's happening in Gaza by going and killing other people. That just actually multiplies it. I'm glad that's not how it works. Although the Israeli government does think that that's how it works. The only thought of, hey, wait, but you're a bad person too. Stop saying that I don't love people. You don't love people. That is a cognitive mechanism for handling your uncomfortable emotions in a way that absolves you from feeling the need to have to do anything about it or think about it. That part of your brain is wrong. I'm not saying it's evil or bad. It's wrong. Maybe that is what evil is, though. All right. And I'm almost out of tea. Here's a more thoughtful manner of action and contemplation. I would like to construct an alternative narrative to the one we have been telling ourselves, which is internally inconsistent. The one we have been telling ourselves is internally inconsistent, based off misinformation, and created through cognitive biases in favor of current imperial power structures, as well as being completely inconsistent with our way of being as Christians, our way of being as Christians, I should say. I would like to construct an alternative manner of thought of what total nonviolence might look like. It might sound something like this. 1. I believe violence in all its forms is a violation of the sanctity of human life. That's it. It's not very partisan, is it? I'm not much of a liberal, am I? When I say those words. Violence in all of its forms is wrong. 2. I refuse to silently participate in the benefits that come from and propagation of imperial power structures that support violence against Palestinians, and that, in the same, compelled anti-Semitic European colonial powers to form ethno-states and persecute and oust their Jewish communities as if they were a problem to be solved by moving the violence elsewhere, rather than being a blessing, not because they're Jewish or not Jewish, but because they are people. I refuse to engage, 3, in philo-Semitism. Philo-Semitism is appropriating Israeli culture, Jewish religion, in a way that doesn't fully recognize Jewish people, Jewish plight, and can be used to, for example, support political actions by powers that are harming Jewish people, like the actions of the Zionist Israeli apartheid state. That's a little definition for you. All right. I refuse to engage in philo-Semitism, here's a bit more of a definition, by relying conceptually on the destruction of the Jewish people and religion in my understanding of eschatology, while appropriating Jewish culture and Israeli political entanglements for the benefit of my own religious or political ends. All right, that kind of explained it better than I did. Okay, 4. I will decry the violence of Hamas resistance through murder and kidnapping, and the violence of oppression of Israeli occupation, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing, and murder of tens and thousands of innocent and non-innocent people in Palestine. Every death is a death of my Savior Jesus, the Palestinian Jew. And not every Israeli is a Jew, by the way. Just every Israeli that is given constitutional rights or whatever their founding document is Jewish. Alas. In ethno-state. 5. I will not engage in both sidesism and decry both sides as wrong when there is a power imbalance and an aggressor to the region. I will stand firm on the side of the victimized, against aggressors, oppressors, and colonizing powers, both toward Palestinian people and toward the people dwelling as Israeli settlers, and the Jewish diaspora across the globe. I will defend victims wherever they are. I will take their side. For example, an example of this idea of both sidesism being problematized is if a husband is abusing his wife and she has once before stolen a candy bar when she was a child, we do not hold them to the same standards of morality, scrutiny, or allyship. We would help the woman get out, if at all possible, and it would be unethical not to. So it would be unethical not to take the side of somebody down a power dynamic that is trying to defend themselves. And we certainly wouldn't be supporting the political power that is oppressing them and aggress the region, for example. There you go. 6, I will take up the mantle of talking about Palestine when my Christian brethren refuse to, and take the mantle of engaging in Christian action through protest, prayer, and patronizing critical charities, providing aid to people suffering, no matter where they are or who inflicted that suffering. No matter if I think whether somebody is good or bad, they are a part of the family of God, and I will not abide their destruction in any way. 7, I will change my theological engagement as to not allow myself to foster apathy in the direction of my own self-interest. I will not engage in the virtue signaling activism of evangelizing people without working toward their liberation, especially when my country, culture, or Christianity is oppressing them and my evangelizing of them is benefiting me. I will continue, like, I don't know, going on vacation on a mission trip, for example. Good example. I will continue to learn and not take everything Noah says as gospel, but critically engage with this address and its sources and the issues discussed and topics and sometimes defined words, and vow to myself as a Christian duty to learn. And if you've gotten this far, you are part of the beloved community. That is part of this new vision of nonviolence, the first step of which is learning. Power is the ability to afford to not to learn. That is a quote by Carl Dusch. We are learning right now, and that is the first step of other empowerment. 9, I will continue working until all peoples are liberated from oppression and free from violence, not just in Palestine, but all around the world. If anyone is a slave, we are all slaves. 10, I will use nonviolent means toward activism. Silence over shouting, displaying better over denigration, holding my own anger long enough that it resolves into peace. Not punching or bombing or shooting, but holding arms open, speaking and bringing flowers. But I will be violent toward my own inaction, murderous of my own hate, and furiously unrelenting in making peace no matter what the personal cost, only counting the cost of my inaction toward others. I will not equate normalcy or legality with violence, nor relent in disobeying unjust laws, as Martin Luther King Jr. said in the letters from a Birmingham jail. Got it. 11, I will take responsibility of my own engagement with suffering. I am responsible to my theology and political engagement, not the algorithm or what I've been told on Sundays or what I've assumed. I am responsible for not supporting ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and murder. God, help me not crucify you over and over. 12, I will engage in action together with other Christians and bear the apathy of those that call themselves Christian but do not care about or engage in Christian action. I promise, 13, to ask the Spirit to show me I am loved, because poverty of love is the soil that grows hate into violent action. 14, I will bring peace to the warriors within me, making war against helping others and showing love uniformly by my beliefs and actions. And this peace will overflow into the whole world and every people like wind. 15, Father, forgive us. We know not what we do. Forgive us and make us new. Shalom.